This is not an official National Society Daughters of the American Revolution NSDAR podcast and does not necessarily represent the position of the NSDAR. This interview is being conducted for the Daughter Dialogues Oral History Project. The interviewer is Risha Rainey. The narrator is Allyson Morrison. Allyson, let's begin by having you tell me more about your upbringing. You are a part of the baby boomers generation and were born in Baltimore, Maryland. Tell me more about your childhood.
All right. I like to think that I am part of the cusp of the baby boomers, just transitioning over into Generation X. I was born in Baltimore. My parents were both Baltimore City school teachers. I went to private school for elementary school. Then my parents moved to Howard County to Columbia. We built a house there. I started attending the Howard County public schools after my mother died.
How old were you when your mother passed away?
She passed away just before my 12th birthday. I went on to major in nutrition science and then biological science at Drexel University.
And what degrees did you receive from Drexel?
I got a bachelor's degree in nutrition science, which is really nutritional biochemistry. And for me, I was planning to go into research rather than into, say, work in a hospital, clinical work. After I got my nutrition science degree, my bachelor's, I went straight into graduate school and I got a master's degree in biological science. And I ended up working with insects. After that, I got a job working, would you believe, in infectious disease, working with a virus.
That's very timely right now in 2020 in the middle of a global pandemic.
Absolutely. After a couple of years doing research, I then decided to be an at-home mom. I felt that that was the best way to raise my kids, and it was my choice. And then I went back to work, first in full-time research, and then eventually I ended up doing library reference work or computer research for an environmental science library. And after that, I retired.
And what are some of your hobbies and interests?
The best way to describe my hobbies would be to say, I play with string. For me, I am interested in any material that you can draw out in a line. I do a lot of knitting. I spin. I have done jewelry work. I've done jewelry fabrication. Now in retirement, I usually work mostly with knitting.
How did you get interested in that? Do you think it's somehow related to your science background, maybe replicated in knitting? Do you think there's any correlation?
Knitting has a lot of math in it. And perhaps for me, I was attracted to the graphic form of knitting. You can take a piece of graph paper and graph out a picture, and then you can knit that picture and have a sweater with a picture of, say, a flower. You can also use knitting and graphing as a way to record something like binary numbers. You could almost think of it as a computer program. And I have actually taken binary code and knit it into a scarf. And then for me, that was just...
Wait, explain that. How do you take binary code and knit it into a scarf?
Yes, you can. If you think about base 2 numerals, you can have a 0 or a 1. And so with knitting, you can have a knit stitch and a purl stitch, or you could have a knit stitch and a hole. And so I took some information, and in this case, it happened to be the playlist of musician friends' music. And I translated the letters into binary code, and then I knit all of that information into a very long scarf. I think the scarf was maybe 8 to 10 feet long, but for me, it was just a way to prove that it could be done.
Let's talk about your Revolutionary War patriot. What was his or her name?
My patriot's name was Elisha Battle. He was born in Colonial, Virginia, And as an adult, and I think probably a young married adult, he moved from Virginia to North Carolina. And I think one of the reasons he moved from Virginia to North Carolina was in order to acquire land. At the time that he moved, which would have been, I believe, the 1740s, Virginia was getting more settled and North Carolina was wilder. Some people got land by grant. My ancestor, Elisha, over the course of his lifetime, he bought hundreds of acres of land. And it was, I believe, all or most of his land was in what is now Edgecombe County, North Carolina.
Do you know how he could afford all of this land?
I'm thinking, I think at least a portion of it came through the work of human chattel, of slaves. Elisha was a slave owner. I'm not sure when he acquired his first slaves, but I think that at the time he moved into North Carolina, he owned a few slaves, maybe 3. And it's likely that he took profit from the work of those slaves and used that profit to buy land. And I also think that when he married, his wife may have been given slaves either as her dowry or she may have inherited slaves from her father when her father died. I think Elisha accumulated his resources that way.
What was his service for the American Revolution?
Elisha's service for the Revolution was not military service. He performed what is considered to be civil service. He served in the Committee of Safety for his county in North Carolina, for Edgecombe County. And so he served on what would be, I guess, like a county council. He served a term meeting with other landowners, helping to govern the county. Elisha married a woman named Elizabeth Sumner. Her roots were also in Virginia, and I believe he married Elizabeth in Virginia, and they traveled to North Carolina together. They had a fairly large number of children, and I'm descended from the son named William Battle. And William actually did not live very long. He died at a fairly early age, but he did marry, and then he had a son whose name was Joel Battle. Joel Battle was the first of the Battles who became actually wealthy. Joel Battle somehow accumulated a great deal of land, many slaves. I have read an estimate that at the time of his death, I'm not sure about this, Joel Battle started a factory. It was a cotton mill on the banks of the Tar River, and that factory was run with slave labor. So I'm going to be very careful. I'm not quite sure how many slaves he owned, but he owned enough to run his factory. And I think his next descendant was William Horn Battle, who became a lawyer. And after William, there was Kemp Plummer Battle. Kemp Plummer Battle helped write the Articles of Secession for North Carolina when North Carolina seceded from the Union. So he was definitely on the Confederate side. And Kemp Plummer Battle was also president of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill after the Civil War. Kemp Plummer Battle had, again, a large family. One of his sons was named Thomas Hall Battle. Thomas Hall Battle was my great-great-grandfather. He had a child with a former slave named Ann Battle. Their child, Elizabeth Battle, was my great-grandmother. Elizabeth Battle was born about 1875. She lived until 1957, and she is the oldest relative of whom I have a picture. I actually got to see what Elizabeth Battle looked like. Elizabeth Battle had 4 children with her husband, Richard Battle, and Richard Battle had been born on the Battle property as well. Richard Battle, her husband, was older than Elizabeth, and he was born a slave. Their child, one of their youngest children, was my grandmother, Mabel Battle. Mabel's oldest child was my father, Earl Hagen, and Earl Hagen was my father.
Well, that's a fascinating rundown of your history, descending from a patriot who contributed to the founding of the United States of America.
I like to think that that line participated in many of the major events in history. For me, it's been very instructive to study everyone, the white and the black members of the line. And I've learned history and I've changed the way I think about history.
What got you interested in genealogy?
I got interested in genealogy because my grandmother refused to tell me anything about her family. When I was younger, I asked questions and I asked all of my relatives. I asked my mother, I asked my father, I asked my grandmother, what was your family like? What did your mother look like? What did your father look like? And she would say, I don't know. I don't remember. They're dead. And my grandmother had a mind like a steel trap. She remembers everything. And so when she suddenly refused to talk and said she didn't remember, I knew something was wrong. And by the time I was a teenager, I learned to pretend to be asleep when I was around her, particularly if there were other older relatives around. And if she thought I was asleep, she would start talking about things that she didn't want me to normally hear. And while I don't remember most of it, I did get a sense that she knew a great deal more about her history than she was telling me. After my grandmother died, I then started talking to other relatives, and many of them didn't know, but they were at least receptive. And then finally, my uncle talked to me. And one day he brought up something that I should have noticed and didn't. He said, did it ever occur to you that there's a reason why your grandmother and a lot of your relatives look like they're white? And in my mind, bingo, I realized it was because we were a mixed race group. There had to be a white ancestor in there someplace. And that's when my uncle said, your grandmother had a white ancestor. And she didn't want to tell you about it. And I felt like a fool. My father has dark skin, but my other relatives have very light skin. I grew up thinking it was perfectly normal to have relatives of lots of different skin tones, but it never occurred to me to wonder why some people had light skin and some people had dark skin. After my uncle said that, I sent away for vital records about my great-grandmother, and her death certificate came back. She did not have a birth certificate. North Carolina did not require vital records to be recorded when my great-grandmother was born. But by the time she died, she was living in Baltimore City, and in 1957 or 1956, vital records were required. I got her death certificate, and on her death certificate was the name Thomas Hall Battle. And I was able to look that up, and that's how I found the White Battle family. And from there, I traced it back to Elisha Battle.
How did you feel when you learned that Elisha Battle was a contributor to the American Revolution?
For me, the fact that he was a patriot was a good thing, but it was not for historical reasons. I have to admit, my first thought was, this is great because I can do something with this in genealogical terms. By that time, I had been reading about genealogy, and I knew that if I found a patriot, I could then consider applying for membership in the DAR. And the reason I wanted to do that was because I had read that the DAR was the gold standard for genealogy. What I found traumatic was finding out that the Battle family were slave owners.
Do you think that's why your grandmother was hiding this information from you?
I don't think she was hiding the information because they were slave owners, because if you're African American in this country, there's a good chance that some of your ancestors could have been enslaved. That's something that I think I took for granted. I think she was upset because she grew up in proximity to the Battle family, to the modern Battle family. And I think relations between my family and the Battle family were probably not very good. And my grandmother knew how to hold a grudge. So she was upset about that. I also think she definitely didn't want me to contact them. She knows I'm very curious, or she knew that. And she definitely didn't want to deal with that. And I don't know if there's any other history between her and the Battles because she never told me. And it's really hard to know how much contact there was between the families. I just know that there's more of it than I know about. And there's more than I'll ever really know.
Did you ever try contacting the Battles?
Absolutely. Oh, my grandmother knew me well. And I guess I did everything she didn't want me to. Once I started researching the Battles, the Battle family, and I have to say, my grandmother's maiden name was Battle. So that was a big clue there. I was living in North Carolina at the time, and a lot of the Battle family is buried there. And I started looking at them, at these tombstones, and I thought, I wonder if I'm related to any of them. It turns out I was related to all of them. But eventually, I got a phone directory, and I looked through to see if there were any Battles in the phone directory. And I found one person living in the right place, in close proximity to where my relatives had lived. And I thought about it, and I thought about contacting this person, and I realized this was my one chance to talk to the descendant of somebody who had owned my ancestors. And I would always wonder what would happen if I had talked to them. And I had to do it. So one day I picked up the phone, I dialed this number, and a nice old lady answered the phone. And I asked if she was Mrs. Battle. She said yes, or if she was of the Battle family. And then I told her who I was, and she told me in no uncertain terms that no one in the Battle family, in the white Battle family, had ever produced any black children. And I thought, she either doesn't know or she's never going to admit it. And I said, oh, but I'm sure that we are related. And I told her how we were related. And she told me to call her lawyer, which I did. And her lawyer was not helpful either. And I have since found out that her lawyer was also a relative. So that conversation only lasted a couple of minutes. It was useful to me because then I knew where the slave-owning family stood on the matter. And what I'll say is, while they believe that no one in their family ever produced any biracial children, we might be the only family.
Did you have any difficulty researching your family lineage?
Battle family line, once I'd confirmed the fact that my ancestors I had both black and white Battles in my ancestry. The white Battles had written a family history book. And so I was able to use that to get some information. But I also found an application for the Sons of the American Revolution, which had the lineage written out. And that was very helpful.
And who was that application for?
That application was written out by Thomas Hall Battle, my great-great-grandfather. He was the person who fathered the biracial child. So it was very neat for me. It took me exactly to the place I could go. I had the Sons of the American Revolution application that took me right up to Thomas Hall Battle. And then his daughter was my great-grandmother. And from that point on, I actually knew all the people because that was my grandmother and my father.
Do you know around what year Was it that he was in the SAR, Sons of the American Revolution?
Well, Thomas Hall Battle died in 1936, so he would have applied to the SAR, I'm going to guess sometime in the 1920s.
What got you interested in joining the Daughters of the American Revolution?
I was interested in the Daughters of the American Revolution because I had read in a book about African American genealogy that the DAR was the gold standard in genealogy research. I knew that there were not many African American members of the DAR. I had read about Lena Ferguson, who had joined I think it was the Washington, D.C. chapter of the DAR. And so I knew that it was probably still a little bit controversial. And I felt that if I could join, then I should join, simply because I needed to be there, because I like inclusivity, I like diversity, and the DAR, if it was ever going to change, it needed to start with just a few people. And why not me? And that's something I learned from my family.
Did anyone try to discourage you from joining the DAR?
If you mean my family, I didn't tell them.
Wow, so you've kept your membership a secret. How long have you been a member?
I have been a member of the DAR about 18 years.
Wow, that's a long time to keep a secret.
And my family, I think they know about it now. I just started telling people maybe within the past year or so. And essentially what I did was I started doing my research at a time when the relatives who would have had severe objections had died. And then now that the older generation of relatives have died, I've come out with the secret. And the younger relatives, and by that I mean anybody in my generation, it's just not as big an issue. I'm a child of the civil rights movement. I was born during the civil rights movement. And so by the time I went to school, schools were already, at least technically or legally, integrated. My parents and grandparents grew up they attended Jim Crow schools. In some cases, they may not have had a school to go to. For instance, my mother was born in rural Virginia, and in her county of Virginia, schools for Black children stopped at 7th or 8th grade. There was no high school at all. And I believe that my mother and grandmother moved to Baltimore in order for my mother to attend high school and college. So when you grow up in that kind of an environment, they grew up in a segregated society. And so for them, joining the DAR was simply not a possibility. And for them, genealogical research wasn't a possibility. I don't think they ever considered doing it.
So why did you decide to go ahead despite knowing that your family would have reservations?
I'm curious. That's the reason why I'm a scientist. I want to know how everything works.
So what were you curious about in particular when it came to joining the DAR?
Well, I didn't know anything about it. So I wanted to know what they were doing in the meetings. I wanted to know if they had a secret handshake or just what they looked like. In the DAR, I have finally found people who talk more genealogy than I do. And that is the only place I've ever found that.
Well, how did you feel when you first were welcomed in as a member? I know that they do a new member welcome ceremony. How did you feel when you were standing there?
I was absolutely thrilled. I was inducted in the DAR about a year after I had first contacted them. And my paperwork went in, and I got the call from someone in the chapter to let me know that my application had been accepted in July. Since the DAR usually does not have meetings, the chapters do not have meetings over the summer. I had to wait. They said, we'll induct you in September. So that gave me some time to calm down, which I did not do. But I went to the September meeting, and I have to admit, I don't remember at what part of the meeting they did it because I was absolutely nervous.
Why were you nervous?
It's a big deal. I got called up to the front, and I think I was probably standing with the regent, which is like the president of the chapter. And I have no idea who else was with me. And I raised my right hand. I was inducted by, I think it was the chapter chaplain. And what was going through my mind was, does my hair look okay? Am I going to fall down? And I cannot believe this is real. And it was an important, poignant ceremony because I thought, this really is happening. I'm a member of the DAR. That's just incredible. And I have to say, I am very, very fortunate in my chapter. When I first contacted my chapter, I was terrified at how they might receive me. Everyone was friendly. If there's anybody in the chapter who's not friendly, they've stayed far enough away that I never noticed. And it's just a great group of people. And people have been welcoming. And I remember one of my best friends in the chapter came up to me one day and just said, I want to get to know you because I want to know how you got in the DAR. And that's usually the reaction people have. It's like, how did you manage this? And then we talk genealogy and everybody's good.
Do you ever try to encourage other people to join?
Yes.
How long did it take to do all of your research in order to prepare for your application submittal?
I tried to get most of my paperwork together before I ever contacted the DAR. And I did that because, again, I was afraid of how I might be received. And so before I made contact, I wanted to make sure that I knew what I was talking about. Once I made contact, the way that I did that was I used the internet. I looked to see if there were chapters in this area. I then sent an email and said, this is my name, this is my information. I'd like information about joining. And then I gave a rough idea of where I was in my research. And sometime later, probably within a few days or weeks, someone from the chapter contacted me. And again, we went over my documentation, and she then told me when I could come to a meeting. And at that point, at the end of the phone call, I said, by the way, there's something you need to know. And I said, I'm African American. Is that going to be a problem? And what she said to me was, my husband is African American. And at that point, it was like, bingo, this is the right group for me. She knows.
Was this back roughly in 2002?
Yes.
And have you been active since you joined?
I was active for about the first 10 years. I had a couple of committee positions.
What committees?
What was interesting is, as soon as I was inducted, they said, here's your committee position if you would like. And they said, would you be willing to take over the website, which is called Volunteer Information Service? And would you be interested in Constitution Week? And I wanted to be nice. I had no idea what I was talking about. And so I said yes. I had to learn how to create a website. And I started working on a website. My husband's a computer programmer. I drove him nuts. I did actually, with his help, get a website built. And so that was my committee hosting the website. And I kept that committee for about 10 years. And then I have a rare disease. I have gradually had more difficulty walking. And a few years ago, it became too difficult for me to attend meetings, so that I have not been going to chapter meetings. And about a year or two ago, I realized that I could still work on the chapter's website from home. So that committee was open, and I have become my chapter's webmaster again. I've rebuilt the website. And so that's my contribution to the chapter now.